Thomas, Eleanor, Claire, and Adam Derby were the perfect family in the perfect town, until one cold November morning, when all four were found murdered in different rooms, each killed in a different way. What looked like a random act of violence soon unraveled into a web of secrets, betrayal, and a locked house mystery that would leave even the most hardened detectives shaken to their core. Maple Hollow was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower. Nestled between rolling fields and dense woodland, it was a community where everyone knew each other's names, birthdays, and even what pie they preferred at the annual fair. Crime was almost unheard of, except for the occasional petty theft or a teenager's prank gone too far. In this quiet backdrop stood the Derby family home, a grand two-story house of white brick with a wraparound porch and carefully trimmed hedges. To the townsfolk, the Derbys were the picture of stability. Thomas Derby, the father, was a successful businessman who donated generously to local causes. His wife, Eleanor, was admired for her warm demeanor and charity work, often seen organizing food drives or volunteering at the school. Their daughter, Claire, was 17, bright, and already accepted into a prestigious university. Their youngest, Adam, was just 9, a boy who seemed to know everyone in town. From the outside, theirs was a life people envied, comfortable, respected, and untroubled. But perfection can hide cracks that few notice. The family rarely attended public events together, and when they did, there was a stiffness about them, a formality that didn't quite match the image of closeness they projected. Neighbors whispered about nights when muffled arguments could be heard through the open windows, quickly followed by an eerie silence. Some recalled seeing Eleanor alone late at night, walking briskly through the neighborhood, as if trying to outrun her thoughts. Still, no one in Maple Hollow could have imagined that behind the closed doors of the Derby home lay a tension deep enough to tear everything apart. The house that stood as a symbol of success and family pride would soon become the center of a tragedy so haunting that it would scar the town forever. The morning of November 14th began like any other in Maple Hollow, but by mid-morning, a sense of unease began to ripple through the neighborhood. Margaret Wells, the Derby's closest neighbor, noticed the house still locked up tight, well past the family's usual waking hours. The curtains were drawn, the driveway untouched, and the faint hum of the heating system was the only sign of life. Concern grew when repeated knocks at the door went unanswered. Margaret tried calling Eleanor's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Something felt wrong. At 9:42 a.m., she called the local police to request a welfare check. Officers arrived minutes later, their footsteps crunching over frost-coated grass. The front door was locked, but the officers quickly gained entry. Inside, the air was heavy, almost still, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The first discovery was in the study. Thomas Derby slumped over his desk, papers scattered beneath his lifeless hand. A deep wound in his chest left no doubt about what had happened. Upstairs, the horror continued. In the master bedroom, Eleanor lay motionless on the bed, a pillow partially covering her face. In the adjacent bathroom, Claire's body rested unnaturally against the tub, her skin pale and lips tinged with blue. In the small bedroom down the hall, young Adam was found curled up under his blanket, a dark stain seeping into the sheets. Each scene was different, each method of death disturbingly unique. Seasoned officers stepped back, shaken. The silence of the home, broken only by the creak of the floorboards under their boots, was suffocating. Outside, the street remained still, unaware that a nightmare had just unfolded within its quietest house. By the time the coroner arrived, the Derby family's story had turned into Maple Hollow's darkest chapter. The investigation began with confusion. In most homicide cases, there was a pattern, something that tied the victims' deaths together, a single weapon or method that could help build a profile of the killer. But inside the Derby home, nothing made sense. Thomas had been stabbed with a single, precise blow, almost surgical in its execution. Eleanor showed signs of suffocation, no marks on her body except the faint crease from the pillow pressed against her face. Claire's toxicology report revealed she had been poisoned hours before she died, the chemical a rare compound not typically found in household products. Adam, the youngest, had been shot at close range, the bullet lodged in the headboard behind him. Detectives were unsettled. Different methods often suggested multiple offenders, but there was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle in any of the rooms. The house was disturbingly neat, as though the killer had moved with deliberate calm. It felt staged, yet there were no obvious signs of an attempt to cover up the crimes. Forensic teams combed through every inch of the property. Fingerprints belonged only to the family and a few frequent visitors. Footprints in the carpet showed no unfamiliar patterns, and even the dust on the windowsills was undisturbed. Whoever had committed the murders seemed to have an intimate knowledge of the home, moving through it without hesitation. The lack of consistency in the methods made it difficult to determine motive. Was this a message? A symbolic act? Or had the killer wanted to make it look like the work of multiple people? Detectives knew that without a clear link between the murders, they were chasing a shadow, one that had already slipped silently out of Maple Hollow, leaving only horror in its wake. The most baffling detail of the Derby murders was the complete absence of any sign of entry or escape. The front door had been locked from the inside, its deadbolt still in place when officers arrived. Every window in the house was shut and latched, with no broken glass or tampered frames. Even the back door, which many Maple Hollow residents often left unlocked, was secure. It was as though the killer had simply vanished into thin air. This mystery led detectives to believe the person responsible had either been inside the house before the murders began or had left in a way no one could immediately detect. They examined the attic, basement, and crawl spaces, searching for any sign of hidden passageways or unusual damage. Nothing. The home was as ordinary as it appeared, yet it had contained a massacre no one could explain. Attention turned to the family's inner circle. If no break-in occurred, the killer had likely been someone the Derbys trusted enough to let inside, or someone who already lived there. But interviews with neighbors and relatives only deepened the mystery. No visitors had been seen arriving the night before. No strange vehicles had been spotted on the street. Detectives considered the possibility that one of the victims could have been the killer, ending their own life after committing the murders. But forensic timelines quickly ruled this out. The sequence of deaths showed the killer had moved from room to room in a controlled, purposeful manner. The locked house puzzle became the focal point of the case. How had someone managed to commit 4 separate murders without leaving the faintest sign of forced entry or escape? It was a question that would haunt investigators long after the Derby home fell silent. While the crime scene offered few physical clues, the answers began to emerge from the paper trail left behind. During a meticulous search of Thomas Derby's study, investigators found a small wastebasket filled with shredded documents. The fragments were carefully collected and sent to a forensic reconstruction team, who spent days piecing them together like a gruesome puzzle. What emerged was startling. Bank statements and transaction records showing large sums of money being transferred to an account under a coded identifier. The amounts weren't random. They had been increasing steadily over the past 6 months, each withdrawal larger than the last. The final transfer, made just 3 days before the murders, had emptied one of Thomas's private accounts entirely. The transactions were routed through several offshore banks, making them difficult to trace. There was no listed account holder, only a string of letters and numbers. This suggested a deliberate effort to hide the recipient's identity. Investigators began to suspect blackmail or an illicit business arrangement gone wrong. Adding to the mystery, Eleanor's personal records revealed she had recently withdrawn a large sum of cash from her own savings. No one knew where that money had gone. Friends claimed she had seemed distracted and tense in the weeks leading up to her death, though she offered no explanation. The financial discrepancies shifted the investigation's direction. Detectives wondered if the Derby murders were not an act of random violence, but the result of a calculated plan to eliminate anyone connected to a hidden fortune. Money often left trails, but in this case, the trail was deliberately obscured. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure the transactions would be almost impossible to follow, and perhaps to ensure that no one left alive could explain them. The Derby home was thought to have an outdated and largely useless security system. Most of its cameras hadn't worked in years, their wiring corroded and hard drives empty. Still, investigators decided to inspect the system in case something had been overlooked. During a crawl through the attic, a technician discovered a small, dust-covered device hidden behind an old storage box, a camera that was still connected to a functioning power source. When the recovered footage was played back, it offered the first real glimpse of the hours leading up to the murders. The grainy black and white images showed a single figure entering the hallway just after 2 a.m. The person moved with an unsettling calm, pausing occasionally as if listening. Their face was obscured by a hood, but their posture suggested familiarity with the space. They never hesitated when turning corners, as though they knew the layout perfectly. In one chilling moment, the figure stopped directly beneath the attic camera, tilting their head slightly, as if aware of its presence. Then, without a word, they continued down the hall and disappeared from view. The footage ended abruptly minutes later, leaving investigators uncertain whether the camera had malfunctioned or been deliberately shut off. There were no signs of forced entry on the footage, which deepened the locked house mystery. The person seemed to already be inside when the recording began. This raised disturbing questions. Had they been hiding in the house before the family went to sleep? Or had one of the Derbys willingly let them in? Attempts to enhance the video for facial recognition failed, but one detail stood out: a faint, irregular mark on the figure's right wrist, visible in the dim light. Detectives noted it carefully, suspecting it might be the key to identifying the killer. As investigators worked through the Derby family's background, they uncovered a name that had been absent from town conversations for years: Adrian Clark, Eleanor Derby's older brother. According to public records, Adrian had once lived in Maple Hollow but left abruptly after a bitter inheritance dispute with his sister. Their parents' estate had been divided unevenly, leaving Adrian with little, while Eleanor and Thomas gained the family home and most of the assets. Neighbors from that time remembered angry confrontations on the Derby porch, followed by Adrian's sudden disappearance. For years, no one in town had seen or heard from him. There were no public records of employment, no property in his name, and no official trace of where he had gone. But a week before the murders, several residents reported seeing a man who looked strikingly similar to Adrian walking near the outskirts of Maple Hollow. He was described as gaunt, with a noticeable limp and wearing an old brown coat despite the mild weather. Investigators began to suspect that Adrian's reappearance might not have been a coincidence. Financial records revealed that shortly before the murders, an attempt had been made to access one of Thomas Derby's private accounts from a remote location. Though the attempt failed, the IP address traced back to a rural area just outside town, a location where an unregistered cabin had been found abandoned days later. Inside the cabin were scattered food wrappers, a burned-out wood stove, and a crumpled photograph of the Derby house. The possibility that Adrian had returned to settle old grievances now seemed plausible. Yet no concrete evidence tied him directly to the killings. His sudden appearance, and the fact that he vanished again immediately afterward, made him both a prime suspect and a ghost, close enough to touch, but impossible to find. Just when the investigation seemed to be stalling, a plain, unmarked envelope arrived at the Maple Hollow police station. It bore no return address and had been slipped through the station's mail slot sometime during the night. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, the words written in block letters with a black marker. Asterisk, they took what was mine. Now, no one will have it. Asterisk, there was no signature, no date, only the faint impression of the pen's pressure on the paper. At first, investigators assumed it was another cruel prank from someone following the high-profile case. But forensic testing revealed something more troubling. Though most fingerprints on the paper were smudged beyond recognition, a partial DNA trace was found along the edge of the page, likely from saliva or skin cells. The results pointed to a familial match with the Derby family, but not to any of the 4 victims. This revelation narrowed the field of possible suspects to relatives, both immediate and extended. Investigators revisited family records, focusing on those who had lived away from Maple Hollow for years. The most intriguing detail came when the lab results were compared with old police records. The partial DNA showed a close relation to the Derby's eldest son, Nathan, who had been declared missing 5 years earlier. Nathan had left town after a series of heated conflicts with his parents over money and independence. Rumors suggested he'd been involved with dangerous people, but nothing had ever been confirmed. Until now, no one knew if he was even alive. The letter's message, combined with the DNA match, painted a grim possibility that Nathan had returned, driven by resentment, and taken revenge in the most brutal way possible. Still, without proof of his whereabouts, he remained a shadow in the growing mystery. The DNA match to Nathan Derby shifted the entire investigation into a new and unsettling direction. Detectives began retracing the years since his disappearance, piecing together fragments of his life from scattered records. It emerged that Nathan had been living under a false identity in another state, working sporadically and moving often. His trail was marked by low-paying jobs, short-term rentals, and cash-only transactions, signs of someone deliberately avoiding notice. Interviews with people who had crossed paths with him revealed a man hardened by bitterness. Some claimed he spoke angrily about betrayal and being erased from his family's future. Records confirmed that after a major falling out, Nathan had been removed from his parents' will, with his share redistributed to his younger siblings. To investigators, this provided a potent motive: anger, combined with a sense of being replaced. More troubling was a series of sightings placing him near Maple Hollow in the weeks before the murders. Surveillance footage from a small gas station captured someone resembling Nathan purchasing supplies late at night. The man kept his hood up, but a faint, irregular mark was visible on his right wrist, eerily similar to the one seen in the attic camera footage. As detectives connected the dots, the image of a calculated revenge plot began to form. Nathan may have returned quietly, studying the family's routines, choosing different methods of killing to create confusion. The letter found at the station seemed almost like a signature, taunting, personal, and dripping with resentment. By the end of the month, a warrant was issued for Nathan's arrest. Yet even with this breakthrough, one detail remained unsettling. If Nathan had planned everything so meticulously, where was he now? And why had he vanished again, just as the net was closing in? The answers were still out of reach. Before detectives could act on the arrest warrant, news came from a motel 20 miles outside Maple Hollow. A cleaner had found a man dead inside one of the rooms, the blinds drawn tight, and a faint odor of chemicals in the air. The ID found in his wallet was fake, but fingerprints confirmed the truth. It was Nathan Derby. The cause of death was ruled an apparent overdose, a mix of alcohol and powerful sedatives. Beside the bed, on the small table, lay a spiral-bound notebook. The first few pages were blank, but further in, investigators found a series of handwritten entries. They were chilling in detail, describing the night of the murders step by step, how each family member had been approached, the methods chosen, and the sequence of events. It was written in the first person, almost like a diary, and ended with a final sentence. Asterisk, it's done. No one wins now. Asterisk. At first, the notebook seemed to confirm Nathan's guilt, but handwriting experts quickly raised doubts. The style of the letters, the pressure of the pen, and even the slant of the words did not match known samples of Nathan's writing. Further forensic testing revealed the pages carried only partial fingerprints, none of them Nathan's. This discovery shattered the case wide open again. If Nathan hadn't written the confession, had he been set up? The overdose, too, began to look suspicious. The concentration of sedatives in his system suggested it could have been forced. In the end, the official report left the case unresolved. Publicly, Nathan remained the prime suspect. Privately, many detectives believed someone else had orchestrated the entire tragedy, someone still out there, protected by layers of misdirection. The Derby family's murders became Maple Hollow's darkest mystery, destined to remain unsolved in the town's memory.